At long last, we can finally recap some Supercars action in New Zealand in what I would call a fairly solid weekend of racing, I think, for Supercars in their return to the land of the long white cloud. As usual, I'm here to recap the pros, the cons, all sorts of thoughts around the racing we just saw over the weekend, so let's get stuck into it. We'll kick things off, as we always do, with a couple of race recaps. Although I am streamlining these, I figure that most of you have either seen the race or at least the highlights, so I'm not going to recount them play by play, but the overarching theme for Saturday was one word: rain. It looked miserable, and I was watching on TV. I can't imagine what it was like being out there in that weather, but the fans stuck it out and they got a pretty good show, I think. The ultimate result was a homegrown victory. Andre Heimgartner taking the top step, Will Davidson in second, and Anton De Pasquale in third in a fairly good, strong result for Shell V Power Racing. On Sunday, things dried out and it was somewhat service resume as normal, with Will Brown and Red Bull taking the victory. Brock Feeney in second, and Anton De Pasquale, though, still backing the strong Saturday form up with yet another third position. How did everything stack up against my pre-round predictions? Well, it's the usual story, not that good. I did get one thing right though, that was that Ryan Wood would have a breakthrough weekend. I classified this as a top 5 result, and he accomplished that on the Saturday. In fact, just missing out on the podium. I thought it was a fantastic performance by him, and I'm really curious to see how his form might look in the back half of this season with the kind of trajectory he is on. My second prediction was that Kostecki would get a top 5 result at certain stages of the weekend. This actually looked kind of promising, but he certainly showed a little bit of rust and didn't finish in the top 5. And then my final prediction I also thought was going to come true, especially on the Saturday, a Ford vs Chev barnstormer of a race. It was teeing up very nicely in that nice close battle between Heimgartner in the Chev and Mostert in the Ford, but unfortunately Mostert, as you all know, had some major issues that derailed his race, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the video. That brings us to Clash Chat, the part of the show where I pick the most controversial moment from the weekend, which can sometimes be a little bit of a difficult task to do, but I didn't have to wait long in Taupō, because about 30 meters into the race on Saturday we had quite the collision between pole sitter Cameron Waters. Tim Slade and Will Brown also played a bit of a role in that one. So to set the scene, Cameron Waters on pole position, not the greatest start off the line there. He went to cover off Tim Slade, who was going up the middle between Waters and Brown, and ultimately the three went into one. There was a bit of a collision, particularly between Slade and Waters, and that fired both those guys into the wall. I saw Tim Slade copped a lot of flack on social media for this. I really feel that was unfair. Yes, he went for a gap that did ultimately close, but he was fully alongside, if not just about ahead of Cameron Waters by the time that collision happened. So I feel like he earned his space there, and that he had no reason to really back out of that one. Now, to be fair, I think he did sort of jink quite aggressively towards Waters off to the left when Brown did come across on him, so maybe that's where people feel like a lot of the blame is, but once again, he was taking avoiding action here. I think he'd earned that spot on the racetrack. So for me, this one was absolutely a racing incident. I get the pain of Waters fans, a season that promised so much as just being an absolute disaster so far. So I get the frustration, but I really do agree with the stewards that this one was simply a racing incident. Most of you guys seem to agree with that thought as well. I put the vote out to get a gauge of your opinion on this incident. 49% of you said it was a racing incident, 25% went for Slade, and then just about even split blame between Waters and Brown, although they're pretty low percentages. Let's talk about the weekend wins. These are the things that I enjoyed as a fan watching the sport. Firstly, we have to start off with the fans. It was so good to see the level of support that's still there for Supercars despite the short hiatus in recent years. And let's not forget there were question marks about Taupō and its suitability to have an event like this. There were question marks if fans would make the extra travel from Auckland, if a town like Taupō could facilitate an event like this. But from what I could see, it looked like a massive success. And again, that's all thanks to the fans showing up, making the effort, and toughing out, especially those rainy conditions on Saturday. The other key thing to talk about, I think, as a great initiative was the track to town. This is where the supercars literally drive from the circuit into the middle of town and park up in a big sort of community celebration. And I think this is fantastic. I think supercars need to do more of this stuff. Obviously, the track to town concept only works in a few places like Bathurst and Taupō. But yeah, I think the concept itself of having the supercars on public streets is really, really powerful and helps announce when the sport actually arrives in a town, which only happens for most places once a year. So yeah, I'd love to see more of this stuff, even if it's just a car or two going down Riverside Drive here in Perth in a few weeks' time. I think it's a great way to get the name of the sport out there more. In terms of the on-track stuff, I really enjoyed the removal of the fuel drop rule. This was the rule that said the teams, usually have to put X amount of fuel in the cars during the race at sprint events. They scrapped that for this weekend, and I think it was a good move because it put the emphasis back on the pit crews and how speedy and accurate they are when they're changing tyres. As for the weekend woes, the things I wasn't so much a fan of, obviously the Saturday race was really interesting from a weather perspective. It would have been great to see it sort of go dry, wet, but we did see some fluctuations in the rain and obviously pace differing as a result. But the Sunday race was a bit tamer than I hoped. It was a bit of a slow burn. We had a good battle between the Red Bulls towards the end, but it was a bit of a journey to get there. There were cameramen, zooming in on clouds, zooming in on chunks of rubber. That's when the TV director is getting a little bit desperate to show something interesting. And I think that leads into my second weekend woe, which I'm going to put a big caveat on because I don't want to be unfair, but I was feeling a little bit of Pukekohe pain this weekend. The return to New Zealand did remind me just how much I miss Pukekohe and that really unique track that has so much supercars history attached to it. But I think it's part of the grieving process. Pukekohe's gone. It's not Taupō's fault. It's amazing that we have got New Zealand back on the calendar. But yeah, I feel like naturally comparisons are going to be made between the two tracks, and I felt like Taupō, while an interesting circuit, doesn't have those same, thrilling sections like the final sequence at Pukekohe that for me just made New Zealand such a wild supercars event. But who knows? It's going to build its own history in the coming years. It's going to build its own identity, and I'm curious to see where it's at in a few years' time. Let's hand out some awards, starting with the surprise of the weekend. For me, it's Dick Johnson Racing. I was really impressed with their form. They got a double podium on the Saturday, and I think both drivers doing well is an encouraging sign for that team. They've had glimmers of hope, but rarely both drivers performing at the front. And then on Sunday, ADP backed it up with another podium. Will Davidson did have a bit of a rougher time, but again, I think overall a really promising sign for that team, hopefully turning a corner. The V7 award, who dropped the cylinder? It's got to be Walkinshaw Andretti United. They really did cost, unfortunately, Chaz Mostert a potential victory on Saturday with that botch pit stop. And just to add insult to injury, the wheel fell off Chaz Mostert's car and then he crashed into it as well, launching it into the off-field. But yeah, it was a rough weekend for those guys. Again, lots of potential, unfortunately, just not delivering on those opportunities. Who gave it the Jandor? I must admit, there were some great drive jobs this weekend, some awesome slides, some awesome catches, but I can't really pin down a single moment. So if someone's particular driving at a specific moment really impressed you, let me know down there in the comments below. I did see a Porsche do a 360 in one of the support races, which caught my eye, but I'm sure there were plenty of other moments out there on the track. And in terms of the special shout out, I've mentioned it a few times, but again, just has to go to the fans. I was at Bathurst a couple of years ago in that horrible rainy weather. I didn't have the guts to show up on that Saturday when it was absolutely torrential. The fans in New Zealand are clearly a lot harder than me because the vast majority of them stuck it out on Saturday in those really tricky conditions. Overall, I'm going to give this weekend 4 out of 5 stars. I feel like the on-track stuff probably warranted more of a 3 out of 5, but the whole event itself, especially with things like that track to town, just elevated it that little bit. So I'm going to go for 4 out of 5, and that's where the majority of you landed as well. 51% of you saying 4 out of 5, and 31% of you, the next quadrant, going for the full 5 out of 5. So overall, pretty positive it would seem most people are feeling. In terms of comments, so there were some interesting discussion points, so thank you as always to those who submitted some. I picked a handful here. We've got Elise, sorry I'm terrible with names, but they will give it pass marks. They said it was an awesome field across all drivers, as the weekend was the first for Supercars in Taupō. And yeah, this is a good point. I feel like there was good representation from a lot of teams. Obviously, Brad Jones Racing, they had a long, much needed victory with Andre Heimgartner. It was great to see them back in the fight. Shell have re-emerged as a contender for podiums and hopefully in the future race wins. There were lots of interesting stories like that up and down the field. And I feel like the race results themselves as well, there's a fair bit of movement from the starting grid to the ultimate finishing order, even if there wasn't a huge amount of wheel-to-wheel racing itself. Mark, on the other hand, though, says he doesn't feel like the track is suited to these cars, and I would tend to agree to a large extent. It was better than I anticipated. I feel like there were more overtakes and interesting racing lines than I thought coming into the weekend, but there's no doubt a few parts of the track I think that hurt the racing, at least for Supercars. I thought turn 1 battles would continue through turns 2 and 3, but unfortunately the geometry of those corners seems to nullify those battles. And then we got that big back straight, and I did think we would see a handful more battles than we did through that final sequence of corners. I did flag it as one of my curiosity points heading into the weekend, but unfortunately it did under-deliver a little bit. It's one of those really awkward corners where it's not a slow enough chicane to, justify a lunge down the inside on the brakes, but it's not fast enough either to be one of those sort of seat at the pants corners where the drivers are sliding through there at high speed. It's that frustrating middle ground. So while of course you've always got to be careful not to ruin a track when a big form of motorsport rocks up to it, I would be curious to see if they can do some sort of alternative layout while retaining what's currently there for Supercars to use, and hopefully encourage some more overtaking at the end of that back straight. And then finally, Mad Kiwi says, Taupō was better than I expected it to be. The fan turnout proves there is a market here for a second race in New Zealand, and I would fully agree. It's just a no-brainer to have a second event in New Zealand. You're paying huge amounts of money to send the cars over there. The fans would happily support, I think, 2 events, especially if one was distributed to the South Island just to create a bit of distance between them. I think it would be a great move for the series. And of course, more racing in New Zealand I think is great for us as fans. Let's wrap things up though by looking at the standings. Will Brown leads the way over his teammate Brock Finney. I'm really curious to see if the intensity keeps ramping up between those two as the championship goes on. They can't stay friendly forever, surely. Chaz Mostert there in third, despite some frustrating moments, still doing quite well there in the championship. Richie Stanaway in fourth, Payne in fifth, Percat in sixth, Jack LeBrock in seventh, Andre Heimgartner in eighth, and Will Davidson in ninth. On the team side of things, Red Bull Racing continued to lead the way with a more convincing lead over Penrite Racing. Erebus there in third, Shell V-Power Racing fourth, WAU in fifth, and you can see some of the other teams down that list. But attention now turns to Perth, my hometown. I'm so looking forward to seeing Supercars back here in just a few weeks' time. Really curious to see how the amended Super Sprint format goes, and I'll be talking about that and a lot more in my round preview for the next event. So be sure to subscribe if you want to be around for that one. I plan on doing a news video or two before then as well. So thank you so much for your support. Do drop a like, be sure to subscribe, treat people like your trackside, and I will see you in the next video.